Well, I estimate, and others who are familiar with the war to this point estimate about 120,000 dead Russian soldiers. There may be some additional dead if we separate Chechens and people from the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. You may add another 5,000-10,000 into that category. But on the whole, it's the loss ratio is for every one Russian killed, you usually had somewhere between 6 and 8 Ukrainians killed. Over the last several months, and this happens at the end of every major war, if you go back to the Second World War, the Germans actually took most of their losses in the last 6 to 8 months of the war. We find that hard to imagine, but that's true. When an army begins to retreat, is overwhelmed by your firepower and your capabilities, things fall apart. As they fall apart, more and more and more people are killed, wounded, or captured. Well, that's what's happened in Ukraine. Now, bear in mind that the secret police in Ukraine, working with the CIA, MI6, and Mossad, have been pretty effective at essentially shooting anyone who doesn't want to fight, jailing anyone who doesn't want to fight, or forcing them at gunpoint into action. But now we do know there are gangs in Ukraine. When I say gangs, I'm talking about groups of men who have decided to organize themselves to resist any further compulsory military service. So they can no longer round up people off the streets or go to people's houses with impunity, drag people out, drag men out and put them into vans and cars and take them off to be killed. So things are falling apart in Ukraine. But again, this man Zelensky knows that if he can create disillusion in people's minds, then this can go on longer. And remember that about a third to 40% of everything we send to Ukraine, I'm talking about cash as well as equipment, ultimately disappears into the black hole of corruption. And officers in the Ukrainian army, battalion commanders and above, have all been supplemented with income based on the corrupt redistribution of American cash. Remember, we support the entire government. Nothing would work. Nothing could go on for 24 hours without vast infusions of American cash. And we've also seen them resell large quantities of equipment. They've even resold equipment to the Russians, which is some people shake their heads in disbelief, but it's true. We've seen people in Mexico and the drug cartels and the armed organizations there in organized crime walking around with weapons they purchased from the Ukrainians, including Javelin missiles, which is a very lethal system. I mean, you can defend against it and fight against it, but if you're on the drug cartel payroll and somebody tells you to use a Javelin missile over the border, you're in serious trouble because there's no way for you to be prepared for that. So this is a very serious situation, and it's not going to get any better in the near term.
Has what's happened recently ended the threat of a possible World War III scenario coming from the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or is that still possible?
I think that President Trump has failed to impose his will on his own administration as well as the Congress. What do I mean by that? He has not taken definitive and decisive stances. And if you don't do that, then the danger of rapid escalation and the involvement of other countries in the war becomes very real. And I think that's where we are right now. If you go back to President Eisenhower in 1956, we had something called the Suez Crisis, where the British, the French, and the Israelis jointly decided to invade Egypt with the goal of recapturing control of the Suez Canal. And of course, the Israelis were told, if you come in on this with us, we'll give you Suez. So the Israelis invaded, the British and the French all invaded. When Eisenhower discovered this, he was infuriated, and he immediately went public and he told the British, the French, and the Israelis to get the hell out of Egypt. We did not support this. And he made it abundantly clear that we, under no circumstances, were prepared to go to war with the Soviets at that point, because the Soviets had come out and said, if the British and the French and the Israelis do this, we will intervene in Egypt to save the Egyptian government. Well, that's, Eisenhower didn't want anything to do with a war in Egypt or anywhere else in the Middle East. And so he forced the British, the French, and the Israelis to retreat. He told them, if you don't retreat, there will be consequences, financial, economic, and otherwise for you. And of course, they knew then, as they know now, without our support, without our financial backing, without the military equipment and technology we're prepared to provide, they can't sustain themselves for any length of time. The same thing's true today in Europe. Europe has what I call Lilliputian armies. These are small organizations designed to conduct safaris in Africa. In other words, to intervene in places where there isn't much capability, to impose, solutions, political, economic, military, whatever they are. They are not prepared in any way, shape, or form to take on the Russians. And when they talk about spending more on defense, it takes 10 years to build effective military forces. You don't build those overnight. And they don't have the resources. Their economies are in as bad shape, if not worse, than our own here in the United States. So how could you possibly extract more wealth from the population? And their welfare systems, if you will, their social security nets are much more extensive and complex than our own. So the notion that the Europeans are going to be in a position anytime soon to take on the Russians is absurd. So the whole thing needs to stop. It makes no sense. The Russians aren't interested in going to war. They want an end to this, but they want to be assured that their country will be protected. And we have failed repeatedly to address the legitimate security interests of the Russians. It would be as though we in the United States were concerned about hostile forces in Mexico attacking our citizens and destroying our property, and then ultimately doing nothing about it. And when we did something about it, and we have in the past intervened in Mexico to stop things, then we would argue, well, we have a legitimate security interest. Your radicalism, your revolutionary spirit, your activities, your criminality is spilling over into the United States. We can't have that. So we have intervened previously and pushed the Mexicans away from the border, especially the forces that were down there. Imagine what we would do today if we saw Russians and Chinese in great numbers inside Mexico training, arming, and equipping Mexicans to fight us. I think the reaction in the United States would be far more violent and immediate than what we're seeing from the Russians. But effectively, that's the analogy.
Pope Pius XI said, men must look for the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. And he urged that the faithful give public honor to Christ the King so that individuals and states would submit once more to the rule of their Savior. And that is why LifeSite News is raising up the image of Christ the King across the United States. And you can help us reach millions more. Please pledge your support today for these billboards at lifefunder.com/Christ is King. What could President Trump do in order to, as you said, sort of make his will more concrete in terms of where we're going on this war, but also what can the people of the United States do in order to encourage that an end to the bloodshed there, which, as you said, could escalate?
Let's answer the one about the president first. The president talked when he was running for election, shortly after he was inaugurated, about ending these overseas conflicts, stopping our interventions in these things. And he boasted that he could get on the phone, make some phone calls, and end the war in 24 hours. That statement was ridiculous because the issues at stake in Ukraine are very complex. The Ukrainian problem, if you will, has been there for hundreds of years. There's a long history that we can't go into right now, but there are reasons for the people feeling the way they do on all sides. But the point is, for us as Americans, I think the most important thing for President Trump to say right off the bat immediately is, number one, under no circumstances do we support a war with Russia. Make that clear. We don't support it. We don't want to be part of it. That's number one. Number two, if Kiev doesn't understand that we under no circumstances are prepared to go to war in Ukraine on their behalf, then it becomes important for us to do two things. Number one, stop all aid to the Ukrainian government, period. No more military assistance of any kind. Number two, I am withdrawing, if I were president, I would say I'm withdrawing all American citizens in and out of uniform, intelligence, or otherwise from Ukraine, period. Well, at that point, the Europeans are saying, well, you're leaving us hanging. And the answer is no. I'm telling you, this is a European problem that Europeans need to solve. And the only way to solve this is not to try and build yourselves up militarily, because that's not going to work. It's to talk to the Russians. That has to happen. That's what should be done. I mean, President Trump says, oh, I want the killing to stop. This is terrible. Fine, Mr. President. I just told you how to do that. And I've been saying this for months. And I'm not the only one. And he, instead of following his instincts, he usually has pretty good instincts on these things, he's listened to the wrong people. And he's tried to impose himself on this, pretending that he is in a position to somehow or another sort it out. He can't. We don't live there. We need to come to terms with that reality. You know, Charles de Gaulle used to say two things. He said people in Europe need to understand these two things. Number one, Great Britain is an island, and Americans don't live in Europe. He was right.
Indeed. Indeed. And so how can the American people assist the president to take these actions, which I'm sure he's getting pushback on from a lot of different parties?
Well, remember that large numbers of people in Washington, and particularly on the Hill, have stuffed their pockets with cash as a result of this, what I would call phony military assistance program. Because what we do is that we say we're going to allocate X amount of dollars to buy equipment. Well, the equipment goes over, most of the dollars stay in Washington. And the dollars go to the military industrial base, to the various firms and corporations that are providing things, in return for which members of Congress, in addition to owning stock in these things and benefiting in that form, receive campaign donations. Thank you so much, Senator, Congressman, for supporting this massive aid program to Ukraine that's made us very rich. When from day one, anyone with any experience in the region knowing anything about Russia and Ukraine knew Ukraine could never win. Impossible. Even President Trump admitted that. So what they've got to do is they've not only got to contact the President of the United States, they've got to flood their senators and congressmen with messages that say, and this is the only thing that they listen to, Dear Mr. So-and-so, dear Senator so-and-so, if you don't stop aid to Ukraine and end this war, I will never vote for you again. That's what they listen to because that's what they're most concerned about, staying in office. If they can't stay in office, they can't line their pockets with the extra cash. They can't play illegally in the stock market, which is what they've been doing up there for years. And here's the bad news. When you have someone who steps forward like Thomas Massey from Kentucky, and he says, I'm not going to support your spending bill. I'm not going to support the aid package for Ukraine. Then President Trump turns around and says, he's my enemy. I'm going to crush him. Why? He's the only man of any integrity or common sense. Everybody else has got their hands out for more cash.
Let's turn for a moment to the other hotbed in the world right now, and that's in Israel. Tell us what you think is happening there in Israel and what potential that has for either escalation or coming back to some kind of relative peace.
I actually talked to President Trump in November of 2020 about Iran, and I know that at that point, at any rate, he was absolutely resolute in his opposition to a war with Iran, which I thought was a very good thing. Of course, this predates the catastrophe in Gaza. Now he's got a different situation because I think he owes a great deal to his position in the White House to extraordinarily wealthy Jewish donors. And these are all advocates for and agents for Mr. Netanyahu and what he wants to do for his so-called Greater Israel Project. And I think President Trump is trying to satisfy them, reassure his Jewish constituents who are so wealthy and influential, because you know how the Israel lobby operates. It's technically a foreign lobby, but we treat it as a domestic lobby because most of the money comes from domestic sources. Remember, you had someone like Adelson, who was an Israeli who then got American citizenship. So when he contributes hundreds of millions of dollars to the Israel lobby, well, then we say it's from an American source. And we have lots of these dual citizens. We have people on the National Security Council staff who are Israeli citizens who also hold American citizenship. We really didn't face this in a dramatic way until really the late 60s and 70s, because up until 65, if you voted in the election for a foreign government, if you served with a foreign military establishment and swore allegiance to the country in doing so, well, that was considered illegal, and you were stripped of your citizenship. I think we need to go back to that, frankly. But for the moment, that doesn't exist anymore. And so you have this very strange arrangement. And so President Trump has to deal with this. And he thus far has tried to make everyone happy, because if there's one flaw in President Trump, it's his desire to be popular. As Harry Truman said, if you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog. Perhaps he should go back and remember what Truman had to say. But I don't think he understands that. He loves adulation. And when he goes out, he wants to be cheered and he wants to be worshiped. And that makes him feel as though what he's doing is right. So he's very sensitive to optics. But at the end of the day, there is no strategy. Everything is impulsive. In other words, within the last few days, you had articles that came out in the news saying, well, America is close to an arrangement with Iran, a new deal based on 3.2 or 3.5% uranium enrichment, and a new way to dispose of the enriched uranium or share it with others and so forth. All of a sudden, last night, he came up and said, no enrichment, can't have it. Well, no enrichment means eventually war with Iran. Now, remember that Pakistan and India have hundreds of missiles and probably hundreds, if not thousands, of nuclear warheads. No one ever raises this matter. So Iran sees this as a question of sovereign independence. Why should they give up their sovereignty as an independent country? Because Israel doesn't want them to have access to nuclear power. Because the Israelis think that any access to nuclear power could result in Iran becoming a nuclear-armed power. And they want to remain the only power in the region with nuclear weapons. And so we are there to ensure that they enjoy this monopoly, which they insist is vital to their long-term security and existence. This is not a good thing for the United States. And I say, in all seriousness, Mr. Trump needs to look in the mirror and ask whether or not he's about America first. Because we have no interest in going to war with Iran. How much they enrich is of no real consequence to us, especially when they agree to be inspected, when they agree to arrangements that allow third parties to validate. That should be good enough for us. We're opposed to nuclear proliferation in the sense of weapons, and that would seem to satisfy the requirement. But it is an absolute condition stipulated by Mr. Netanyahu and his agents in the United States who fund the Israel lobby that Iran may not have nuclear enrichment.
What do you make of that crazy proposal that Trump put out as an AI video about Trump Gaza and making it free for everybody? What was the message behind that? Because I think a lot of people now realize Trump does some things, he overplays his hand, he speaks perhaps in hyperbole or something. What did you make of that? What do you think it means, and especially for America right now?
A friend of mine said to me the other day, it's very difficult for someone who drives a Lamborghini or a Ferrari or is chauffeured in a limousine all the time to understand what it's like to drive a Ford pickup truck to work every day. And I think that's the problem. I don't think President Trump grasped what was happening in Gaza. Now, that's his fault. He needs to dig into things. He doesn't. This is not a detailed personality. This is not someone who reads and absorbs information at a very high rate. This is someone who doesn't read much of anything. He told a friend of mine, somebody asked him about the Constitution, and they said, don't you know what's in it? And he said, well, I don't know all those details. Have you read it? He said, well, not really. Well, then you've got to read the Constitution. He said, no, I don't. If I need to know what's in it, I have people here on staff that I pay to tell me what's in it. Well, that's a dangerous position to take for someone who is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces and the chief executive of the American government. Do you really want to depend on a small inner circle of people that may be your friends and golfing buddies to tell you what you need to know? And I'm sure some of these golfing buddies who have billions of dollars are very smart men, and I would take their advice, potentially, depending on the situation, on real estate in New York City, but I don't think I'd listen to much else that they have to say. And I think that's the problem with President Trump. I don't think he's always known. And then I don't think he's prepared to act accordingly when he finds out the truth. I think he's been subjected to a very one-sided picture. Gaza is a stain on the honor of the American people. We should not support any country in the world that is engaged in the mass murder or expulsion of 2+ million people. It's just wrong. I don't care what their race is, religion, or anything else. It's just wrong. But he doesn't seem to grasp that, and so he doesn't talk about it. And I think his comments about, oh, this is great real estate, look what we could do here, I think he was talking to his real estate friends and said, oh, these people are worthless. Look what they could have done with this. They could have had Las Vegas on the Mediterranean. Well, it may come as a shock or a surprise, but most Muslim and Christian Arabs or Palestinians may not be interested in building Las Vegas on the Mediterranean.
Yeah. So I asked you previously with regard to Russia-Ukraine if the threat of a world war ensuing might be over now. You explained that, it's the end, but if the president's will isn't made clear and obvious, and he doesn't go ahead with the push that he knows he needs to do, it might still escalate. What do you think about that same question with regard to Israel, Gaza, the genocide that's obviously going on? Does that have the potential also to escalate into something of a world war scenario?
Yes, I think the Middle East situation is ultimately far more dangerous. President Putin is on the other side in Eastern Europe. He absolutely does not want a war with the United States or NATO. And that, to a large extent, explains why he's been very careful and deliberate in his approach to this conflict. The average Russian is furious, doesn't understand why he hasn't already smashed everyone in Kiev, and why he's not prepared to cross the river and march all the way to the Polish border, because Russians are that angry about what's happened. People have never been told how the Ukrainians have behaved on the battlefield. We get this report, oh, Russians are murdering civilians. That's not true. But the Ukrainians have in great numbers. And the things the Ukrainians have done and the symbols that they've attached to themselves have resurrected this ugly past of the Second World War. And that's a nightmare for the people that live in Russia. So they would have acted already much more decisively. We might be in a much more serious position, but for President Putin. President Putin has reined everyone in and said, no, we're going to approach this carefully. We're going to work as much as possible for a negotiated end. The situation in the Middle East is totally different. Mr. Netanyahu is absolutely, resolutely opposed to anything that does not deliver on the Greater Israel Project. Now, I'm sure some of your viewers have seen Israelis in uniform, and they are wearing a patch. And that patch shows that Sinai, parts of Jordan, half of Syria, and half of Lebanon are all part of Greater Israel. We, Americans, are supporting that. And that means to the Israelis the removal of the populations that are living there who are Muslims or Christians or Shiite. And that's something that, again, I don't think we should support. It's completely inconsistent with what we say our principles and values are. So I think there's a real danger that if we attack Iran, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Israelis, and whether or not we do it initially with them, or they do it, and then we are asked to come in and support them and help defend them, doesn't make any difference. Because the Iranians are prepared. Now, they may not be prepared for the Israelis to use a nuclear weapon. And I hope they don't, but they have the access to that. And they may feel that they can do it and get away with it. Right now, their plan is to destroy two things: the so-called nuclear facilities or weapons or whatever they think is stored there, and the government, because they have this fantasy. in which the government's decapitated and the Iranians all rise up, cheer, and replace the government. I mean, only someone who is drinking heavily from the wrong material is going to believe such a thing, but that's widespread. So I think the truth is this: if what I just described happened, if the Israelis become involved with that, the Iranians will respond, and they have thousands of missiles capable of doing enormous damage to Israel. They will use those. They will launch them in great numbers. Then we will come in to try and subdue the Iranians. And if we do that, the Russians will come into the war because they will not stand by and watch us and the Israelis pulverize Iran out of existence. And at the same time, all the Arab states, I think, will then finally act. That includes Egypt, Jordan, the Saudis, the Emirates. All will act against Israel. I think at that point it would be very difficult for the Turks, who thus far have played both sides to the middle in their attempts to benefit from American support if they cooperated with Israel. They too will be in a position that it makes it almost impossible for them not to come in against the Israelis. That's why I had hoped that by now President Trump would have intervened and said, that's it. I'm sorry. I've gone as far as I can go. This thing in Gaza must end. We're not going to supply any more munitions, any more equipment to kill these people. But he hasn't done that. I'd hoped that he would intervene and say 3.5 or 2 or 4, whatever percent uranium enrichment is going to be allowed is sufficient for us. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to learn to live with it. But again, I keep waiting for the American first president to show his cards. Hasn't happened.
And finally, Colonel Macgregor, you explained to us what the American people could do with regard to Ukraine, Russia, how they could encourage the president that way. What can the Americans do to help the president to come to resolution on Gaza? And do you even think that's possible, given that he has, these mega donors from the Israel lobby?
Well, there's also something else to be considered. Americans have been treated to at least 2.5 to 3 decades of systematic preparation to hate Arabs and Islam. That's important to understand. They've only seen the ugly face, the evil face, if you will, of Islam in the form of ISIS and terrorism and so forth. They've been propagandized to believe that Iran is the mother of all terrorism, which is not true, has never been the case. And they keep telling you that Iran and the region is very much the same as it was 46 years ago. It's not. Things have changed there dramatically. So that's a huge problem. So Americans aren't sure because they're not hearing, the alternative story. Now, some of the evangelical support that he's had is ebbing, as some of these people who describe themselves as Christians are beginning to ask whether or not the teachings of Christ justify mass murder and expulsion of people from Gaza. I would think that answer is self-evident, but apparently for millions it's not. So that all too has to be considered. Again, this is where the president has to demonstrate leadership. He has to impose his will. This is so important, John, if I may call you John.
Please.
Presidents are expected to impose their will. That's why they were elected as chief executives. Imposing your will means if you don't follow me, there'll be a price paid. And presidents have done that in the past. The problem right now in connection with the Middle East, when the president sits down with his advisors and says, how many senators can I count on to support me? The answer is a much smaller number than the number of senators who could be counted upon to support Netanyahu.
Protecting your money doesn't have to be complicated. With stocks, bonds, and crypto, it's easy to feel lost. But gold and silver have been trusted for centuries as a simple, stable store of value in uncertain times. If you had invested $35,000 in gold at the millennium, an amount you can give today tax-free to anyone you love, it would have grown to be worth over $325,000. Call our team at 610-326-2000 and let us step you through crafting a solution for your family.
Finally, just wanted to ask you, I know you're also a man of prayer. Tell us about that in your life and the possibility of still the people of God reaching out to our Lord for help, even in the midst of what seems like crazy negotiations and possible world war. Where is that place for prayer in the American life right now?
Prayer, and this includes the scientific assessments of prayer, is obviously underestimated. Anyone who has studied prayer, whether you believe in Christianity or any other religion, all of the studies of people who engage collectively in prayer have shown that prayer makes a difference. It actually influences things, influences thinking. And I think prayer needs to be addressed, and we need to pray differently in some respects from the way we have in the past. People want to pray for something, and I think what we need to pray for is some degree of enlightenment and justice and understanding. You know, there used to be something that we referred to, and even when I was in graduate school, we studied it, something called just war doctrine. And you can go back through the Catholic Church and find enormous evidence for this. People took it quite seriously. Even the people that entered World War I looked at it carefully, including the Germans and the Austrians, and they all felt that they were justified. Now, this is a different world today, and in many respects at the time they were right. We have to ask whether or not what we want to do as Americans is just. We've got to move away from this sort of knee-jerk reaction. Well, if you don't support the president, you must be one of those people who hates America. Come on, don't be ridiculous. I love my country. If I'm opposed to going to war for reasons that I think make no sense, that doesn't mean I hate America. So when I pray, and I do privately, I pray for understanding, for intelligence, for good judgment, and for justice, and to be a better human being than I am, which is pretty much of a full-time job if you take Christianity seriously. So I think that's where we ought to focus right now. And I wish churches would focus on that instead of what many of them are doing right now. There are too many out there that are really preaching war on behalf of this Israeli state against millions of people they don't even know or understand.
Indeed. That is what has been, I think, for many of us who are in touch with people in the Holy Land, has been so sad. It's been shocking and sad to see the brother Christians of the ancient Christian communities where they are suffering and dying in Gaza, for them to know that their own brother Christians here in the West are either ignorant of their plight and or